Okay. So after the next lecture, there will be a break. So for those of you who are feeling the need, we're nearing a short break. Terry, I love what you presented. I have to be honest and say it's not the first time I've heard of it. But I hope that it was new for some of you or all of you even. I want to share something maybe personal even. 12 years ago, I worked at Checkpoint. And 12 years ago, that was the time when a lot of vulnerabilities started coming up with media files, the whole PNG, JPEG, and so on, and a lot of routing protocols. And then Checkpoint wanted to release what was later to be called IPS protections for IGMP, BGP, OSPF, all of these things. And I, as a researcher, had the goal of researching these protocols and coming up with the ways to protect them from different vulnerabilities. And I remember walking around the building asking people, where can I find OSPF traffic, BGP traffic? Where do you get that? And it's exactly projects like that and similar projects we have here in Tel Aviv University and in other places in the world that I think are, like you said, leveling the playing field and allowing us as researchers to have access to the same resources that attackers have. And I think it's awesome. So. Our next speaker is Wendy Nather. Hope I pronounced it correct. She's the research director at the Retail Cyber Intelligence Sharing Center. Before I call you on stage, I want to ask a very quick question and just shout out the answer. What do you think was the biggest or one of the most significant security breaches in the last 5 years? Sony, Target. Okay. Right. Okay, I didn't hear any of that. But I heard Target, and that's what I wanted to hear. Thank you for that. But yes, Sony, Target. Again, these are consumer products or consumer networks, and I was actually surprised to hear that there's a retail institute, like a collaboration of retail companies. And I heard your lecture the other day, and it was fascinating. And today we're going to hear a different lecture, and Wendy's going to present to us a presentation about the chemistry of data. And I think these two last lectures were the perfect setup, right, Guy and Terry, to discuss this topic. So please allow me to welcome on stage Ms. Wendy Nather.
Okay, I'm all that's standing between you and the break, so I'm sure you're going to keep me honest. As I mentioned yesterday, I returned to Tel Aviv University, which is where I first learned programming at the age of 12. And that was a very, very long time ago because the one computer in the astronomy department here at Tel Aviv University was about the size of a room. And now people are waving around little tiny Linux computers, which is just amazing to me. So that was 40 years ago for me, and I'm very happy to be back. But let's talk about what else has changed in the last 40 years. It used to be, for example, that you had to get physical access to the facility, to the teletype, if you wanted to work on the one computer. And by definition, if you went into that building, you were allowed access to the computer. Unfortunately, that's still the model that we have with some industrial control systems, which is a big problem. It used to be that you worked on separate computers when you were at work. If you were lucky enough to have a PC in the 80s, it was your own personal computer. You worked on it at home. Now there's this convergence of systems where you might be working with your employer's data in all sorts of systems, networked, remote, any time of the day or night. And even more confusingly, enterprises are now using the same software as consumers are at home. Again, it used to be that you didn't use Office unless you were at work. And to this day, nobody uses ERP systems for fun. If you do, come and see me because I need to stage an intervention. And everybody's using the cloud now. So this is the big problem. We are all, with our employers, with businesses, and at home, we're sharing the same systems, the same providers, the same data. So as a result, telling the difference between business data and personal data is very, very difficult. You can no longer tell by when it was created. If it was created at midnight, you were probably still working, which is also really a big problem, so come and see me about that. You can't tell what format it's in. People are using databases at home. You can't tell by where it's located, either geographically. Right now, I've been encountering some kind of weird things trying to access our retail R-CISC portal from here in Tel Aviv. I don't know why they think I'm suspicious, because now suddenly I'm accessing it from Tel Aviv. But anyway, you can't tell by where it's stored, where it's used, and you can't tell by what was used to create that data. If you're having to fulfill a request, if you're doing a forensic investigation, you can't tell if that is business data unless you actually open it up and look at it. So the way we think about data generally in today is in terms of classification, top secret, you're wearing the orange jumpsuit and going to jail if you leak this. It's based on location. If you have no business accessing that system, in this data from China, and it's based on ownership and format and so on. But I started thinking about this when I was an industry analyst at 451 Research and realizing from my own experience as a CISO, that's not all that we do when we think about data. That's not what determines the security requirements anymore. And actually, it never really did. One of the things we need to add to our consideration of the characteristics of data includes time. So, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to need to look at context changes around the data, because that also changes the security requirements, sometimes very suddenly. And we're going to have to think about formulas for how you put data together, because that also affects it. So let me talk first about data events. If you take a very simple example, like a press release, let's say you're announcing a super secret project called Project Cyber. No, that's a bad example. Project Falafel. And you are programming your DLP to look for any mention of the word falafel, and you have to make sure your employees are not leaking it. So you have a whole set of security controls around keeping that completely confidential, until suddenly your business decision to release that press release makes it flip from confidential to totally the opposite, non-confidential. And most of our security technology today cannot deal that quickly with a business decision that creates that data event. Another one is, for example, in options trading. During the time leading up to an options expiration date, that trading data is becoming more and more valuable until suddenly, after the expiration, it's of no use anymore. So these are the sort of things that we need to start thinking about I'm going to talk a little bit more about other ways in which business events and data events can change the security of the data. Statistical thresholds. If you are analyzing data for privacy implications, for example, I used to work at the Texas Education Agency, where we had to comply with the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. That stated that any data other than directory data that could be used to identify an individual student must be held confidential. So the number of left-handed Swedish exchange students in Dallas might be okay, but the number of left-handed Swedish exchange students in Paris, Texas, might fall below the statistical threshold, a sample size of 4, that we needed. So we actually had quantitative analysts on staff to analyze the large sets of data that we have to make sure that when we had to sanitize it, it could be safely given to external researchers, as we were required to by the legislature. So we would spend time taking out the social security numbers, analyzing longitudinal data, analyzing ethnic demographics of data, anything that could be recombined to identify a student, make sure it was taken out, and then we would give the data to the researcher. Then the researcher would go back to the school district and get from them all the data they needed to re-weaponize that data, and we couldn't do anything about it. So that sort of formula work we had to deal with all the time. Another thing that we need to think about is how we focus on data, how we draw the focus. If you think about this, if this spider web weren't here, you'd probably be looking more at the big open area here at the sky. But because somebody laid a spider web over this, the lines are drawing your eyes to that nexus right there. And that's very much how we deal with data. The algorithms that we choose to overlay our data are what draw our focus to particular aspects of that data. And of course, who writes the algorithms? People. And there can be inherent bias in how you write those and how you choose to focus your attention on data. The other thing that we have is everybody sees when something goes viral, the very act of focusing your attention on an individual. Somebody posts something really stupid and you start reposting it and reposting it. Suddenly focuses attention where nobody expected it to be. And my theory is that this is why people are very happy, well, they're not happy, but they're content to have their personal data collected in aggregate because they believe they're never going to be singled out. And the right not to be singled out is something that we should be discussing as a society. That these are some things that you should not be doing. Singling out something in context, even though you don't change the data, can also change how people react to it. For example, after the Sandy Hook massacre in the United States, where a shooter killed 20 children at an elementary school and 6 adults, a journalist went and got the information, the names and addresses of all the gun permit holders in a particular county and published them. Now, this was public data. That he did not leak anything. What he did was he focused and collected this data and drew the attention of the public to these people in the political context of the Sandy Hook massacre. So it was that combination. It was always public data, but he drew attention to those individuals in a specific context, and it was that formula that suddenly made it very controversial. Now, where is SecTigger here? Where's Avi? There, you see? We were thinking the same thing here. So yes, breaking bad data. In law enforcement, probably here, but also in the United States, there's the concept of precursors, especially with dangerous chemicals. If you're collecting ammonium nitrate and you are not a farmer, then chances are you have no business having that, and it is probably a precursor to a planned crime. I submit that we may need to start thinking about this in terms of precursor data too. If there's data that you have no business holding, or you should not be holding for that long, it can only be a precursor to something that we would prefer you not do. For example, if you're holding payment data but you're not processing payments, that could be a precursor indicator that we would want to investigate, something that we should think about. I also want to talk about what I call the principle of least use, which is completely the opposite of the big data hoarding fad that we've had over the last several years. How many of you have known of an application that purposely purged data after it was no longer needed as part of its intended functionality? Anybody? This is not something that we think about when we do design requirements for an application today. When can we start throwing out data? Nobody wants to do it, except for lawyers. They really want you to get rid of the data. But this is another thing that we should be thinking about. How long do you really need to hold on to that? Can you use it as little as possible, process it on as few systems as possible, and so on? And I've worked with developers myself who wanted to collect everything just in case they wanted to use it later, in case their business area decided they wanted to do something different. But we hope we may need to move away from that. So in summary, what a lot of organizations already do, they intuitively understand that they have formulas for their data, what they can safely give to a third party, what that third party could conceivably do with it with data that they have or data that they can collect, and what sort of things should not be stored together and should be segregated as far as possible. The problem is that we don't really know how to do this yet technologically. And so my challenge to you, to all of you who are inventing the future, even as we speak, this is a problem that you may want to tackle. We know that it needs to be done. We know that there are instances, for example, when under the HIPAA Privacy Act in the United States, the name of a doctor is not confidential until that doctor suddenly becomes a patient. And then the same name in the same location becomes confidential. We need to start thinking about these context switches, these data events, these techniques of focusing attention or of submitting queries that can produce a dangerous, volatile compound that we need to work with. So all of these things, we need to think about how time affects data, not just for expiration because it's no longer needed, but just because it's suddenly no longer as confidential as it used to be. And what business decisions change the formulas and the requirements of your data. So with that, let's go chew that over and lunch. Thank you.